Picture a freezing room in eastern France where cigarette smoke hangs so thick you could cut it with a bayonet. Every uniformed man sitting around that worn wooden table carries the weight of catastrophe on his shoulders. Outside, the winter of 1944 is tearing through Europe like a frozen blade. Inside, the most decorated military minds of the Western Alliance are watching their carefully constructed victory crumble into chaos. A German hammer has smashed through their lines. Thousands upon thousands of young Americans are trapped, dying, disappearing into the snow. The Great March toward Berlin has become a desperate scramble for survival. Then Dwight Eisenhower, the man responsible for this entire enterprise, does something that makes everyone question his sanity. He looks around at his defeated commanders and demands smiles. Actual smiles. In the middle of a disaster. His exact words cut through the gloom like a knife. This situation represents opportunity, not catastrophe, and he expects cheerful expressions from everyone present. The generals stare at their supreme commander as though he has lost connection with reality. Germans are slaughtering American boys by the thousands. The entire Western Front is buckling. And Eisenhower wants happiness? But one man in that room actually grins. Genuinely grins. A tall, profane, ivory pistol-wearing general named George Patton finds something amusing about impending doom. What emerges from his mouth next reshapes the entire trajectory of the greatest conflict humanity has ever witnessed. Patton suggests letting the German forces drive all the way to the French capital. Then, he promises, American forces will slice them apart and devour them piece by piece. Eisenhower has zero patience for theatrical bravado. He needs solutions measured in tanks and bullets, not cowboy poetry. So he pins Patton with a direct question: when can your forces launch an attack? Now, grasping why Patton's reply left Eisenhower momentarily speechless requires understanding what that question actually demanded. Eisenhower was not requesting a minor repositioning of troops. He was asking Patton to grab his entire fighting force, more than 100,000 soldiers, endless columns of armor, mountains of artillery, and swing the whole massive organism 90 degrees through hostile winter terrain to strike an enemy that had just demolished everything in its path. Contemporary military analysts considered such a maneuver a fantasy requiring half a month of meticulous preparation at minimum. Numerous experts declared it flatly impossible regardless of timeline. The sheer logistical nightmare made heads spin. Armies of this magnitude do not pivot like sports cars. Fuel lines stretch for miles. Ammunition must follow precise routes. Medical facilities require advanced positioning. Communication networks demand careful coordination. One miscalculation and the whole enterprise disintegrates into chaos. Eisenhower mentally calculated that perhaps 6 days might suffice if the universe aligned perfectly in their favor. Patton glanced at the timepiece on his wrist. Then he locked eyes with his supreme commander. 48 hours, he announced. 2 divisions ready to strike. Give me 2 days. Absolute silence consumed the room. Bernard Montgomery, the British field marshal famous for methodical caution, released an audible laugh. Surely this American cowboy was performing for the crowd. Other commanders exchanged knowing looks. Ridiculous. Utterly absurd. No human being could accomplish such a feat. Patton was not performing. While his fellow commanders were still absorbing the initial shock of German aggression, Patton had already interpreted the enemy attack as a gift wrapped in crisis. He had already commanded his planning staff to develop multiple scenarios for exactly this kind of northward pivot. Supply positioning had already begun along potential routes. His divisions were coiled like springs, awaiting only the signal. Every moment Eisenhower spent deliberating, Patton's forces were already in motion. Eisenhower studied the brash general for an extended moment. The room anticipated dismissal of this outlandish claim as typical Patton exaggeration. Instead, 6 words emerged that would preserve 11,000 American paratroopers from annihilation: permission granted, 48 hours authorized. What remained invisible to everyone in that smoke-filled chamber was the reality that Patton's desperate race toward Bastogne would eventually rank among humanity's most extraordinary military achievements. And Eisenhower's reaction upon witnessing the impossible made real would expose something profound about leadership, trust, and the strange mathematics of war. But comprehending Eisenhower's ultimate response requires first understanding the nightmare unfolding around a small Belgian crossroads town. Because those paratroopers were not merely experiencing difficulty. They were enduring frozen perdition. 3 days before that momentous conference in Verdun, the German war machine unleashed something nobody anticipated. Hitler had secretly assembled a force that defied Allied intelligence estimates. Nearly 500,000 soldiers. Over 1,400 armored vehicles. More than 2,600 artillery pieces. All hidden. All waiting. All pointed at the weakest section of American lines. The operational concept was brutally elegant: punch through the forest-covered Ardennes region, cleave the American and British armies apart, seize the crucial Belgian port city of Antwerp. Success would theoretically compel the Western Allies toward a negotiated settlement, freeing German resources to focus entirely on the Soviet menace approaching from the east. The assault achieved textbook surprise. American intelligence had confidently dismissed any possibility of major German action through the Ardennes. The terrain presented too many obstacles, the analysts insisted. German resources had been depleted beyond recovery, the experts claimed. These confident assessments proved catastrophically mistaken. German armored spearheads carved through American positions with overwhelming violence. Entire defensive units collapsed within hours. Casualties mounted into the thousands during the initial 48 hours alone. Survivors fled in disorder, clogging roads, spreading terror through rear echelon areas. However, a wrinkle existed in this German master plan. A seemingly minor complication. A modest town positioned at the convergence of 7 critical roadways. Bastogne. The Ardennes terrain that made surprise possible also created a logistical choke point. Almost no viable routes existed for armored vehicles beyond a handful of main roads. Those roads intersected at Bastogne. Without controlling that intersection, German supply columns faced impossible detours. Without supplies, the offensive would starve itself to death. American headquarters recognized this geometric reality. Bastogne required defense regardless of cost. The problem: almost nothing remained available for its defense. Most combat units were either shattered, withdrawing in chaos, or positioned too distantly for rapid redeployment. The task fell to an unlikely candidate. The Screaming Eagles. America's elite airborne warriors, the 101st Division, were supposed to be recuperating. 2 months prior, the brutal fighting during Operation Market Garden had bled them severely. They occupied rest areas around Reims, France, rebuilding their strength, absorbing replacements, recovering from trauma. They were exhausted, depleted, and thoroughly unprepared for immediate combat. But geography made them the only viable option. Orders arrived during nightfall on the 17th of December, move immediately toward Bastogne. The transportation situation bordered on comical. Insufficient trucks existed for proper movement. Soldiers crammed into anything possessing wheels, cargo vehicles, jeeps, even commandeered civilian transportation. Winter equipment was critically lacking. Many men embarked toward Arctic combat conditions wearing autumn weight uniforms. Ammunition supplies were dangerously inadequate. Officers instructed their men to carry maximum personal loads and pray that resupply would somehow materialize. 11,000 paratroopers raced through darkness toward an uncertain destination. They arrived mere hours before German pincers completed their encirclement. Then they began transforming frozen earth into fighting positions. Let me paint the reality of what defensive preparation meant during those December days. Soldiers attacked frozen ground with entrenching tools and sometimes bare hands. Sleeping occurred in snow-filled depressions while temperatures plummeted toward 20 degrees below zero. Men watched helplessly as frostbite blackened the extremities of their comrades. Ammunition rationing became so severe that designated marksmen received fewer than a dozen rounds daily. Warming fires were forbidden because flames would betray positions to German gunners. Food was consumed cold when food existed at all. Death became a constant companion. Not dramatic, heroic death. Slow, grinding, freezing, starving death. The 101st found themselves completely isolated. 6 German divisions formed the encircling noose. Roughly 45,000 enemy soldiers against 11,000 exhausted paratroopers. The Germans possessed armored vehicles. American anti-armor weapons had nearly vanished. German artillery dominated the landscape. American gunners rationed their dwindling shell supplies. German aircraft appeared whenever weather permitted. American soldiers could only watch the sky and hope. December 22 brought formal German acknowledgement of the siege's apparent conclusion. German commanders dispatched surrender terms to the American defensive perimeter. The document was professionally composed, almost courteous in tone. It outlined the hopeless American situation with mathematical precision. Surrounded. Outgunned. Facing inevitable annihilation. Honorable capitulation was offered and recommended. Acting Division Commander Anthony McAuliffe examined this Germanic invitation to quit. His initial verbal response consisted of exactly 2 syllables, or nuts. His officers found this amusing but recognized that formal diplomatic communication required something more substantial. McAuliffe considered the matter briefly. Then he composed what would become the most celebrated rejection in American military history. His complete response: nuts. Period. Full stop. Nothing additional required. German officers receiving this peculiar reply experienced genuine confusion. American colloquial expressions did not translate smoothly. Clarification from captured American personnel was required. Upon learning that this response essentially meant, "Go to hell," German fury intensified significantly. Assault pressure on Bastogne increased dramatically. The following 72 hours witnessed brutality that survivors would struggle to articulate for the remainder of their lives. German artillery maintained nearly continuous bombardment. German infantry probed American lines relentlessly, seeking exploitable gaps. German armor prowled through the mist, hunting opportunities for breakthrough. American paratroopers somehow maintained their positions. They held when their ammunition reserves emptied and they resorted to captured enemy weapons. They held when medical personnel exhausted all supplies and performed surgical procedures with pocket knives. They held when men simply stopped moving in their foxholes, frozen solid during the night. They held because no alternative presented itself. But endurance has limits. Without reinforcement, without resupply, without some form of relief, the 101st would cease to exist. Mathematical certainty. Everyone understood this truth. Now let us return our attention to that conference room in Verdun. Patton has made his audacious promise. Eisenhower has authorized the attempt. The brash general departs immediately and begins orchestrating what remains one of history's most studied logistical achievements. Consider the magnitude of his challenge. His combat force is currently engaged along the German frontier, oriented eastward toward enemy territory. He must rotate the entire force northward. In December, through roads glazed with ice, while maintaining combat capability, against a timeline that every expert considers pure fantasy. Patton possessed advantages invisible to his critics. In the days preceding the crisis, his instincts had been screaming warnings. His intelligence chief had detected unusual German patterns in the Ardennes region. While other commanders dismissed these observations, Patton internalized them seriously. He had quietly ordered contingency planning for exactly this scenario. Supply caches had been strategically positioned. His divisions had received subtle preparation for rapid reorientation. When Eisenhower granted authorization, Patton was not initiating planning. He was executing plans already drafted. His forces began their pivot at dawn on the 20th of December. The scale defied imagination. 100,000 human beings. More than 130,000 vehicles. 62,000 tons of material. All wheeling through frozen countryside like some massive military ballet. Patton became omnipresent during this movement. He personally traveled along convoy routes, bellowing at anyone whose progress slowed. He positioned himself at critical intersections, directing traffic with frantic urgency. Subordinates who failed to maintain schedule received threats that occasionally included references to firearms. Pure willpower seemed to flow from him into the machinery of his army. Weather conditions were actively hostile. Ice, snow, fog combined to create near-zero visibility during some stretches. Vehicles slid off frozen roadways continuously. Engines seized in the extreme cold. Men suffered frostbite even while moving. The army kept rolling. What conventional wisdom deemed a 2-week operation was completed in 2 days. By December 22, as McAuliffe was composing his famous rejection, Patton's lead elements were already approaching the Bastogne perimeter. But proximity did not equal arrival. Between Patton's forces and those freezing paratroopers lay German formations fully aware of the approaching relief attempt. Understanding that American reinforcement would doom their entire offensive, German commanders devoted maximum effort to blocking Patton's advance. For days of savage combat followed. Patton's armored spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, encountered resistance at every turn. Villages became fortresses requiring house-to-house clearance. Roads concealed explosive devices. Every elevation concealed defensive positions. Armor engaged armor at distances measured in yards rather than miles. Infantry fought through blinding snow with bayonets and grenades. Casualties mounted with terrifying speed. The advance never stopped. Inside the frozen perimeter, the situation deteriorated toward terminal. Food supplies approached exhaustion. Ammunition rationing became even more severe. Medical situations grew desperate. Morale, though remarkably resilient, showed signs of fracturing. Radio communications functioned intermittently at best. No confirmation of relief efforts reached the beleaguered garrison. They endured in isolation, aware only that they were surrounded and weakening. December 23 delivered unexpected divine intervention. Weather patterns that had grounded Allied aircraft for days suddenly shifted. Skies above Bastogne cleared. Within hours, transport aircraft appeared overhead. More than 200 cargo planes released desperately needed supplies via parachute. Brightly colored canopies drifted earthward carrying ammunition, medical equipment, food. Soldiers laughed and wept simultaneously while recovering these gifts from heaven. Isolation remained their reality. Superior enemy numbers still surrounded them. But now they possessed bullets. Now continued resistance became feasible. And somewhere beyond the German ring, Patton was coming. By Christmas morning, Patton's vanguard had fought to within striking distance of the American perimeter. One final German defensive barrier separated the relief force from the besieged paratroopers. The 4th Armored Division commander transmitted blunt instructions to his leading combat formation: breakthrough happens today, repetition for emphasis, today specifically. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the final thrust. History would eventually honor this officer by naming the primary American battle tank after him. On Christmas Day 1944, he was simply a determined armor commander driving his vehicles through German positions at a location called Bastogne. The assault penetrated German defenses. Armor and infantry pushed through resistance, absorbing casualties, never pausing. Late afternoon on December 26, Lieutenant Charles Boggis, commanding the point tank, observed American uniformed figures ahead. He emerged from his armored vehicle and shouted identification. An exhausted engineer officer climbed from a defensive position. The siege of Bastogne was terminated. The 101st Airborne Division would survive. When this information reached Allied headquarters, the reaction was electric. Staff officers embraced. Senior commanders permitted themselves rare displays of emotion. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the Allied cause possessed genuine reason for celebration. But Eisenhower's personal reaction contained layers that simple celebration could not capture. According to multiple witnesses present at headquarters, upon receiving confirmed reports of breakthrough, the Supreme Commander sat motionless for extended moments. Then he uttered words that perfectly encapsulated his complicated relationship with George Patton. That profane son of a gun actually accomplished it. From Eisenhower, this represented maximum possible praise. Because Eisenhower comprehended something that external observers frequently missed, Patton was simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous weapon in the Allied arsenal. The history connecting these two men stretched back decades. They had trained together during the interwar period. They had theorized about armored warfare together. They had envisioned this very conflict years before it materialized. But their professional evolutions had diverged dramatically. Eisenhower had transformed into the consummate coalition manager. Patient. Calculating. Politically sophisticated. He balanced enormous egos, navigated competing national interests, made painful compromises necessary for maintaining alliance cohesion. Patton had transformed into pure aggressive energy. Profane. Impulsive. Brilliant. He was the sharpest blade Eisenhower possessed, but a blade that constantly threatened to escape control and cause unintended damage. Prior incidents had nearly terminated Patton's military career. The infamous episode involving physical striking of traumatized soldiers in Sicily had required extensive Eisenhower intervention. Unauthorized political commentary had created additional crises requiring damage control. Coming from Eisenhower, who had frequently clashed with Patton's methods, this represented remarkable acknowledgement. But perhaps the most significant reaction occurred weeks later, when the immediate crisis had passed. Eisenhower visited Patton at Third Army headquarters. Witnesses reported a simple exchange. Eisenhower extended his hand, shook Patton's grip firmly, and admitted directly, "George, you were correct." Correct regarding what specifically? Correct in detecting the approaching Ardennes assault. Correct in perceiving opportunity within disaster. Correct in advocating aggressive response. Correct in believing impossible things became possible through sufficient will. Patton, characteristically, declined graceful acceptance of this compliment. His response essentially amounted to, "Obviously, I informed you previously." Even Patton's arrogance could not diminish the magnitude of his accomplishment. He had preserved the 101st. He had reversed the trajectory of the largest battle fought on the Western Front. He had demonstrated that modern mechanized warfare could achieve feats previous generations would have deemed miraculous. Historical accounts frequently overlook subsequent developments. The breakthrough on December 26 did not terminate combat around Bastogne. Fighting persisted for weeks as German forces launched repeated attempts to sever the relief corridor. The 101st, now reinforced but still recovering, continued fighting alongside Patton's formations. Total casualties during the Ardennes campaign reached staggering proportions. American losses exceeded 80,000 across all categories.